everybody. Welcome to Go Beyond. My name is Denise Robinson, and I am the Director of Discipleship and Connections here at Trietsch. Alyssa Robinson usually does this time, but she is feeling a little under the weather, so I'm stepping in at the last minute. So hopefully everything is doing what it's supposed to be doing because I'm new at this. So we'll figure it out as we go along. But I am thrilled to be here with Pastor Daniel Humbert as we go beyond Sunday's sermon. So we are in a new worship series called Trietsch, and we are using the book of Acts to learn a little bit about how the early disciples got started in the church, and I think it's going to help us a lot with information as well. So Daniel, we're so glad to have you here today.
Yeah, it's good to be here, and Denise, I'm glad you're here. I know this isn't your normal task and normal obligation, so I'm grateful that you were able to step in, and we certainly hope that Alyssa will become feeling better here real quick. So we are in this new worship series called Trietsch, and it's a powerful way, I think, to discover how the early church can teach us in modern times. The 21st century church ought to literally become much more like the first century church, and so I'm excited about that, and we kicked it off this past week, and so today we want to go a little deeper, generally speaking, in the book of Acts. And so I think you have a question or two for me to kind of guide me along.
So what is the purpose of Acts, and why is it included in the Bible in the first place? I kind of see it as a great adventure.
Yeah. So in the New Testament, there are really only four kinds of writings, and we know two of those really, really well, right? There are Gospels, the stories of Jesus, and of course there are four of those. And then there are these letters. There's a plethora of these letters written predominantly by a guy named Paul. And then there are only two other kinds of writings, and there's only one kind of each. So there's a book of apocalyptic literature that's called Revelation. And then there's this unique and funky book called Acts. And Acts is referred to as a history. Now, it's not like a history textbook, right? So, but it is telling us the story of the early church and how that church got started. It's why we, on Pentecost Sunday, of course, talked about the coming of the Spirit, because it was the birth of the church. And so the book of Acts takes that early church, the first century church, the first followers after Jesus, and it tells us the story of how that church began and what it was like, and how important it was for establishing kind of, patterns and customs and traditions and ways of being. And the reality is, it was a radical departure from the way the Jewish synagogue worship had been. There were some similarities in terms of worship style, but in terms of how the church would function now as followers of Jesus, this Jew who was raised from the dead, the book of Acts gives us a powerful recounting of how that church literally did what it did. And as we are using it for in the Trietsch worship series, we are using the book of Acts as a model for how, as we re-enter the world now as a church, right? We've been worshiping online, we've been serving in the world, we've been connecting via Zoom. So we're still the church, but as we begin to re-enter, we need to kind of reflect on how did that early church do it? Because the reality is we're going to be much more like a new church launch than anything else. And so I'm very excited about using the book of Acts as a great way to start that off.
So who wrote the book of Acts?
Well, so we don't literally know who wrote the book of Acts, but we're pretty convinced that the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke wrote the book of Acts, and that they give us indicators of that in chapters 1 of both of the books. In chapter 1 of the Gospel and in chapter 1 of the book of Acts, there's this identification of who's writing it and who it's written to. And so that's why we believe that it's written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. And you can also tell in style of writing and kind of message and content that's a similar person. And it's fun to make that connection. And so often we encourage folks when they study Acts to also study the book of Luke. We did that, of course, during Lent. We studied the Gospel of Luke. Now we're in the book of Acts. And of course, we're inviting folks to read the book of Acts throughout the month of May. And so I hope people are doing that. And the month of June. We're already past May, aren't we? We're asking them to read in the month of June. And I think you've got a Bible study. When is that starting for the book of Acts?
So one of the things I notice in reading the book of Acts is sometimes it even seems autobiographical, that, that the author is putting himself in the story.
You can sense that, but it's also deeply entrenched in two primary people. One is Peter at the beginning, and then Paul in the latter part. Paul comes in at chapter 9, but then sort of from chapter 15 and beyond, the rest of the book of Acts, so the latter half, is really about Paul. But there's this sense in which Luke, or whoever that is joining the crowd, if you will.
So one of the things that I noticed that when this new church is trying to come together, how were they treated by society? Because, we read last week when we were talking about Pentecost that they thought they were drunk.
Well, so if you're asking how were the Christians, the followers of Jesus, and therefore the church, how were they treated? They were already beginning to be persecuted. Scholars vary on when the book of Acts was written. Some believe it was written as early as sort of the early 60s, just before Paul's martyr. And then some believe it may have been written as late as the 80s. But clearly, because the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, both Jews and Christians were beginning to get persecuted by the Roman government. And so what you begin to realize with regard to that is that the church and its followers were being persecuted. They were not well regarded. They were not well thought of. And in fact, the government and therefore the common Jane and Joe on the street would not have been, regarding followers of Jesus well. Some would argue they began to be persecuted, but they were also just not held in high regard.
Okay, so, but weren't they a little afraid of trying to, their whole point was to try to spread this message. Were they a little afraid of it?
Yeah, and I think there was a real sense of fear, right? And yet that's a part of the beauty of the book, is that it expresses their deep courage. I won't go into great detail, but a part of what we learn, for instance, in Acts chapters 10 and 11 is Peter has this great dream that helps him become convinced that followers of Jesus will no longer need to become Jewish first in order to then convert to Christianity, but rather they could just convert to followership of Jesus. And so there was great courage on their part, I believe, and that's a part of what I would love to convey to anybody who's reading or hearing the messages over the next many weeks, is that yes, they were afraid. Yes, they had rightful fear because of how they were treated, but they also had great courage, and they had great determination to become that church. And again, I just rereading chapter 4 yesterday, and reminded that they went from 12 disciples to 120 in the upper room to 3,000 on the day of Pentecost, and then by chapter 4, which is only a couple chapters later, and therefore probably only a few days or weeks later, they're already up to 5,000 followers. And so clearly there was something captivating by the message. There was something, some gift that's being poured out by the Spirit that makes this tremendous difference. That Jerusalem, of course, is a thriving metropolis, but it's nowhere near what our big cities are today. And so for 5,000 folks to sort of suddenly come to faith, there is a powerful message both being conveyed and being shared verbally. And Peter, of course, was a part of that.
Well, and just watching Peter's confidence grow is a huge motivator, I think, to all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about this Sunday was the communal living, the end of Acts chapter 2, where it just sounds beautiful. It's this beautiful environment, but I'm sure there were struggles. But what did it look like?
Yeah. So that communal living is actually described in both chapter 2 at the end, which we discussed briefly Sunday, and then it's also at the end of chapter 4. There's another sort of presentation of that. And, in the modern world, we read that and often get very anxious, because immediately coming to our mind is, socialism or perhaps even communism. But the reality was that was not a way to describe an economy. It was not a way to describe a governmental structure. It was a way to describe community. It was a way to acknowledge that genuine and authentic community is lived out together, where I literally depend on you and you depend on me. We keep things in common. And I think, we don't necessarily live that way today as it was literally described. And yet we see pockets of that when there are neighborhoods that really take care of each other and really look out for each other and really sense a way in which they can rely on one another. And I think we all have experienced, whether in a familial relationship or in a friendship relationship, where if I really needed something, I could rely on you. And when I really needed something, you could rely on me, right? I won't name names, but just had a conversation with a church member yesterday, for instance, whose husband is very, very sick. And she described two very descriptive ways that either close church family members or Sunday school class members were taking care of her and providing for her and stepping in as her husband is in the hospital. And so that's a modern day example. We're not living communally, and yet we are being communal in the ways in which we care for one another. And that's really the way that looked. I don't doubt for a second that it caused, either consternation or looks and glances from the Roman citizenship, but also know that that communal living is what gave the strength and the courage to the early church to hang together in such a way that they could then share the gospel and also be martyred for the gospel. They knew that they were there for each other, and there's no better demonstration of that than, hey, I'm going to share my food and my home, or I'm going to share my clothes and I'm going to share my talents and abilities and skills with you, so that we're better off together, right?
Well, and one of the things that reminds us is that even though it was this beautiful words, the truth is the world outside of that was in conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this was a way to demonstrate, hey, a part of this Christian faith is genuine or authentic community. And I won't, spill the beans, but chapter 5, which is a pretty radical chapter in the book of Acts, is indicative of how important communal living is. When somebody doesn't share, or at least offer genuinely and transparently what it is we have to offer, there are consequences. And so I encourage folks to read chapter 5 and recognize that that's not so much about life or death as it is about the importance of communal living and how that communal living has ramifications, both positive and negative, right? I mean, ramifications or consequences can be either negative or positive, right? And so there was a negative consequence for not living genuinely into community in chapter 5.
Well, and then we can learn from each other, which is so important in opening our eyes and listening. So on Sunday, you talked a little bit about the similarities between the original church and today's church. What are some of the things that you think are different?
Yeah, well, just so very quickly, what's similar is that we're living in an extremely diverse world. We're diverse on all levels, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic, educationally, sexually, all of those things. And so that makes us tremendously similar. I think what makes us dissimilar is our intellect, our sort of technologically advanced thinking and processing. And while that's clearly an advantage, I think there are times in which some of that sort of collective intellect and enlightenment can hinder us. I think, I realize, for instance, I'm sure you do too, the older I get, the less I know. Whereas when I was young, I thought, man, the older I get, the more I'm going to know and the more I'm going to understand. And I've come to realize that the more I know and the more I understand, the less I know and the less I understand. And I think that our modernity can sometimes get in the way of our faith. And I think that's the beauty of the first century church, was they were not adulterated, if you will. They just knew that the Spirit was engulfing them, and they knew they wanted to share that, and they refused to get encumbered by everything else. I would say the one other difference as well, and this is probably I don't know if it's the one benefit of COVID, but it's a benefit of COVID, is in the early church, they were not encumbered by their schedules. Prior to COVID, we were encumbered. We were inundated. We were overwhelmed by our schedules, work schedule, social schedule, recreational schedule, families, everything. And one of the benefits of COVID was, oh my gosh, we we don't have most of that. And we might actually either enjoy or be benefited by slowing down a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that has actually helped us to hear, to respond, and to acknowledge our humanity and to recognize the gifts that we each share. And again, I won't spend much time on it, but I mean, all of the atrocities of the last 2 weeks have reminded us of how valuable humanity is. And somehow, some way, we had lost sight of that. And now we're being reminded again that, oh yeah, everyone is made in the image of God, and everyone deserves worth and value, no matter who they are. And so I'm grateful that even out of some atrocities and setbacks, that we can find some positive things.
I'm interested in that first point you made. I think sometimes we're paralyzed by seeing what others are doing. And so we say, well, I can't do enough. So we just sit back and do nothing.
Yeah.
And there's so many different ways to make a difference in this world and share the love of Jesus.
Absolutely. And I would reiterate again to the folks as we kind of close out today, read the book of Acts. You can read a chapter a day and be done by the end of June. If you haven't started, read a few chapters a day to catch up. But the story in the book of Acts is an amazing account of how the church began and how powerful the Spirit's movement in that church was. And so if you want to know, golly, what could the church really be like? How could the church be better? How could we do what it is Jesus originally intended us to do? That's why the book of Acts is in the Bible. It's there to remind us of what church can be, should be, and will be if we'll use the book of Acts as a guide. So I just want to implore folks, read the book of Acts. If you really want to go deeper, sign up for the Bible study that Denise is going to be leading. When does that start, Denise?
It starts June 18th.
Okay.
So, but you will come to the first class having read chapters 1 through 5. So start that right now. Start reading chapters 1 through 5. And you can sign up for that at tmumc.org/acts. And that's an easy way to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So we'll look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday. And hopefully Alyssa will be feeling better to come back and she'll get to challenge me, because I think she challenges me more than you challenge me, Denise.
Well, yeah. Yeah, well, she learned it all from me. There you go. Well, thank you for letting me join you today, even though it was a spur of the moment. I appreciate this time. And I just want to let everybody know to be sure and go to tmumc.org/go beyond for all the episodes. So you can catch up on anything you've missed and then watch these at any time on Facebook. Okay, y'all have a great day.